Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the first chapter of Exodus. Exodus marks a significant turning point. It's the beginning of the first book after Genesis, and it's the first 5 books of the Old Testament are collectively known as the Torah, which is the Hebrew word for law. That's the primary focal point of emphasis in the first 5 books, and alternately known as the Pentateuch from the Greek word for 5. Now, Moses is the author of all 5 books, but he was only alive for the final 4. So Genesis, he got the history 100% accurate from the source of divine revelation. And in Genesis, we read it literally stretches to the dawn of time. And in all the vastness of the universe from the creation itself, we read that man is of central significance in the universal, divinely oriented plan. And then as we progress towards the 12th chapter, we read that Israel is to be of the focal point significance amongst the human race. They're the selected recipients of a creation that had become estranged from their creator. And their patriarch was Abraham, who was selected and rescued from idol worship to found a nation. And the foundation of the nation we read after they became a nation within a nation of Egypt, when they had went down there, when Abraham's great-grandson Jacob had essentially led them down there. So this is the first chapter, marks the turning point, and this is ultimately of much historical significance, so we're going to hop right into it. And these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each one with his household. So the list is the names of the 12 sons of Jacob. He had 4 different wives, and they appear in the order in which they were born. So the order is Reuben, Simon, Levi, and Judah. Now Levi was from the tribe which Moses sprang, and they were to be of the ecclesiastical class, or the priestly class, for the nation of Israel. And Judah is to be the nation from whom the monarch David sprang from. And ultimately, Genesis 49:10, we read that the Messiah was to come through their line, and ultimately, eventually through David. So they established the united monarchy. Now the first monarch was Saul, who was of the tribe of Benjamin, but we haven't even got to him yet. Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, there he is, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All these were descendants of Jacob, were 70 beings, as Joseph was already in Egypt. So the reason that, long story short, Jacob was the favorite of the father Jacob. He was the eldest born of his most beloved bride, Leah. And because he was the father's favorite, he was given a coat to symbolize his love. And this provoked the brothers' jealousy, who conspired to kill him, but it was at the intervention of Reuben that they elected to sell them to Ishmaelite slave traders heading to Egypt. So that's when Joseph wound up in Egypt, and there just so happened to be a famine. It was really the hand of divine providence is evident throughout it all, because he has the ability to interpret dreams, and he also has dreams of his own, in which he visualizes 11 stars symbolizing his brothers bowing down to him. So this really provokes their wrath and retribution. But he winds up in jail, where he interprets the dreams of 2 of Pharaoh's servants, and eventually he neglects to mention it, but then the Pharaoh himself has a dream, and the interpretations of dreams were a highly sought-out prize in the ancient world, and Joseph accurately interprets the premonition behind them, which was to be 7 years of abundance of crops, followed by 7 years of famine. So he advises Pharaoh to appoint a governor to oversee it all, and Pharaoh selects him. So by the age of 30 years old, Joseph is second only to Pharaoh. He's in the functional equivalent of the prime minister's capacity, and he serves with excellence. So he's really the most gifted of Jacob's son as well. And when the famine strikes the adjacent regions of the ancient Near East, sure enough, lo and behold, the Hebrew nation, which was not yet a nation, but really just some patriarchs of tribes find their way down there, and they reconcile, and Jacob moves down there. So by the end of Genesis, there's 70 of them in Egypt, and since then, as we read, they're going to grow. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. And the children of Israel bore fruit, and increased very much, multiplied, and became very strong, and the land was filled with them. So they really become a nation within a nation. That's their national origins. Now, their 400-year period of enslavement was prophesied in advance to Abraham by Yahweh in Genesis 15:13. So he honors his promise that he would be the father of a great nation, but there's also a negative promise that they're to be enslaved, but it's ultimately for a purpose, much as the evil that was worked out for Jacob was ultimately for good, so too is this. Then a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, it was more than just a new king, but really a new dynasty. The majority of scholarly consensus speculates that when Joseph came down, there's three major periods of ancient Egyptian history. The Old Kingdom, which is when the Great Pyramids of Giza were built in the 4th dynasty. There was the first 6 dynasties comprised that period. Then an intermediate period, then a new kingdom, Middle Kingdom. And then the Middle Kingdom is sharply interrupted by the invasion of Hyksos, who were horsebound. They brought horses and chariots, and they were able to subjugate the native peoples. So them being foreigners, they would be naturally more receptive to Joseph as a foreigner. So the scholarly consensus is that the new king in verse 1:8 is really the new dynasty, the beginning of what is known as the New Kingdom, which was the resurgence of native Egyptian power. Amhos the First was the founder of the New Kingdom. So, and again, the pharaohs are not named. I believe there's 2 of them that are named in the scriptures. One of them is contemporaneous to the writings of Jeremiah, and but we only know them by title, so it's ultimately a speculative matter. But we do have an idea, and that's chronologically coincides with the scriptures if you do the math. Come, let us act wisely towards them, lest they increase, and it shall be, when fighting befalls us, that they shall join our enemies and fight against us, and shall go up out of the land. Now, the Old and Middle Kingdom Egypts were very much isolationist, but the invasion of the Hyksos enmeshed them in the international arena of empire, which was carried on from the Mesopotamians. Now, the Egyptian civilization came after the Mesopotamian civilization in the Tigris-Euphrates, but it developed very much in isolation from them, even though they couldn't have, in all likelihood, achieved what they achieved had not their the antecedent civilization done what they did. But they got caught up in the imperial game, so they had to worry about forces outside of themselves that they maybe didn't have to in an earlier era. And the Pharaoh's concern, who is unnamed, as he just expressed, is that these foreigners, this nation within a nation among us, they don't have the loyalty that the natives do, and they could conceivably be an enemy inside our walls should the event come when we tick off the wrong people on the to our northeast. So they appointed slave masters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now, Ramses was the 18th dynasty, was the original dynasty of the of the new kingdom, but the ones known as Ramses, the most famous of which was Ramses II, did not emerge until the 19th dynasty. So there may have been a lapse in time here, but it's ultimately a speculative matter. But the city was named after the monarch. But the more they afflicted them, the more they increased and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with harshness. So they weren't just making them serve, but they were subjecting them to cruel and barbaric treatment. Now, slavery was a fact of life in the ancient world. You can type in Corey Johnston, 1 Timothy 6 for more on that. But the Israelites were the exception, and that the law, which Moses was given, they had limitations for what masters could and could not do to slaves, and durations for which they could hold them. But slavery was a lifelong institution in the majority of the ancient world. You were born into it, and there was no escaping it, save literal physical escapement. And there was, in more cases than not, no limit to the master had complete control, life or death. Do what I say or else. Really, no avenues for legal recourse or any of that. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. All their works which they made them do was with harshness. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. And he said to them, when you deliver the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. So he had earlier mentioned that a concern was, even though they were enslaved, they were multiplying, and this posed a concern. So this enters the equation of euthanasia. They're essentially the ancient equivalent of a Planned Parenthood. They're going to drown the babies in the river. Now, they're not quite killing them in the womb, but essentially when they're born, their entire life consists of dying immediately, and that's really no way to live at all. But the midwives feared Elohim, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, and kept the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said to them, why have you done this, and kept the male children alive? It's an act of deliberate disobedience, but an entirely understandable one at that. But let's hear what they have to say. And the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and give birth before the midwives come to them. So Elohim was good to the midwives, and the people increased, and became very numerous. So, in spite of the pharaonic intervention, one of his fears of their multiplication, he already has them subdued and subjugated into slavery, but he's at his wit's end on how to stymie their population explosion. And it came to be, because the midwives feared Elohim, that he provided households for them. And the Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, throw every son who is born into the river, and keep alive every daughter. So this is his ultimate solution for suppressing the population explosion, which could conceivably threaten now an enslaved population. For example, the Spartans, there was 5 slaves in their society for every free citizen, and this necessitated their unusually strict military state, because the act of suppressing them demanded that they'd had to be military fit, and this ultimately kept them stuck in an archaic system that didn't advance or progress with the rest of the Aegean world, but it was a force second to none. But that's ultimately what I'm trying to tie in together, is that the equilibrium between a slave population and a citizen population, there has to be a delicate balance. Now, the Hebrews in all likelihood didn't outnumber the Egyptians, but they were getting dangerously close to the precipice. so much so that the Egyptians felt compelled. It was clearly a noticeable amount. So this ultimately compelled their intervention. And what happens next? One of those boys is Moses himself, who is rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, of all people. But we're going to have to tune in next time for that one. Stay tuned. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.